Hello, everybody. It is Dr. Boz, and we are live here on YouTube. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I am super excited about the conversation I get to have today. I will warn you that I am here in Texas preparing for some stuff I need to do this week in Texas, as well as be on stage for the Hack Your Health conference. That stage presence is one of my favorite times of the year, but it landed me here in Dallas, where this morning they had a tornado and some golf ball size hail, and the electricity's been flickering around. So I will tell you, we're super excited for this conversation, but my blood sugar is going to have to come to you by way of a Dexcom because my meter is not in my presence. And I'll show you that I have been fasting for the last couple of days, prepping for this. I don't have my ketone meter, but my glucose is 78. Thanks for those of you that join me each week for a fast and an improvement in your metabolism. And I hope that you learn as much as I have learned and hope to learn in this conversation with one of my favorite new, I'm a fangirl of a woman who's just been a great scientist, adding some really amazing improvements to the world of improving people's health, biohacking their health, and really helping me get out of a very stuck label for a section of medicine that I almost was snobbish about not paying attention to. Like, I am not going to give this industry any of my time because I can't seem to believe in it at all. And then I heard this podcast by one of my favorite teachers, Peter Attia, who really likes to get nerdy around things. And although we don't agree on everything, there's quite an overlap of the approach and the framework used to believe in a subject, to really wrap your head around it. And this interview I heard right before Christmas of this past year, and I've spent, I must have gone to listen to every one of the lectures that this guest had out there on the internet, and then really studied her product, have used it here in my body and in my patients. And I am going to take no further time in introducing Colleen Cutcliffe to the stage. Keep in mind, we are watching for your questions, and we will try to, hello, Colleen, use those questions as a way to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. Well, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So everybody wants to hear that you can hear her like I think you can hear her. That always makes me feel better. So let's start out with an easy section. That's a beautiful scene behind you. What state are you coming to us from?
I am in California, Northern California. So we have our nice weather here right now.
No wildfires and no floods today.
We'll take it.
Yeah, right. Well, welcome to the channel. I have warned you, but I'll say it again. This is a live show, so thanks be to God that nothing's gone wrong in the first 3 minutes.
Yes, well, we'll keep praying throughout that everything stays smooth. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, so I have had a brief conversation with you earlier, but I tell the audience that one of the things I like to do, many channels bring on experts, and that's a lovely idea for a channel. When I bring an expert on, I'm looking for the education for me, as well as the people who follow me, that where I've had to fumble the question, that I just really need that expert to take me to the next level. So I'm gonna, you can clean up for me, but I'm gonna praise some of the other podcasts that you've been on and have had a really great foundational conversations on those podcasts. Peter Attia is, of course, a lovely one, but he's pretty advanced, and there's a bunch of his lectures that are behind a firewall. But you've had some other great biohackers that you've been on, like Ben Greenfield, I think. I want to say that, have you been on Levels yet?
I have not been on Levels, but I'm friends with the founders, so I need to talk to them.
Right, yeah, you get on that. But that's the exact same audience. Like almost everybody on the Levels channel, I'm like, oh, she'd been on that podcast and that podcast. So why don't you name a couple of the other podcasts that you think were very well distributed, so they could go listen to you on another podcast if they were trying to find some of the stuff you talk about?
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Kara Fitzgerald. I've done a couple of podcasts with her. Um, I think now you're really putting me on the spot to try to remember these different ones. I think I've done
Mark Hyman, were you on that one?
no, but he and I've done a couple of IGs
Oh,
together.
that's what
So
I saw. Yeah.
yeah. Um, if you start listing people, I might know if I've been
Yeah.
on them. But I think Dave Asprey,
There you
maybe.
go. That was the other one. Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
hmm
Um,
Well, you've been around the block, is what I was trying to say. Is you Google Colleen Cutcliffe, Cutcliffe, any of your podcasts or on YouTube, and well, that's how I found a bunch of your lectures, and they were very easy to find. So I thought I would let you have the reins a little bit, but I was going to tee you up for the parts of the conversation that I think my podcast will, or my audience will like. But also it's leading me to a couple of these questions where, am I telling them right? You need to tell me if I'm right or wrong. So the part that I'd like you to start out with is that to weave your history of where you got your PhD, what you studied, what your first job was, and how it led you to the company that you're leading now.
Sure. Yeah, my background is all pretty basic science research, so I'm not a person who has an MBA running this company, so I've had to learn all that by fire. But my PhD is in biochemistry and molecular biology from Johns Hopkins. I then did a pretty traditional postdoc at Northwestern University, and then I moved out to San Francisco. I worked in a pharmaceutical company. We were developing small molecule drugs for Parkinson's disease. And then I joined a startup company that was building a DNA sequencing instrument. And that company was, went through rapid growth and, I think was really instrumental in bringing us affordable DNA sequencing, which has really changed the landscape of health, not only in human genomics, but also in this emerging field of microbiome science. And I started this company about 10 years ago with the idea that we could use DNA sequencing technologies to identify entirely novel probiotics or prebiotics and things that were important for our health, kind of getting out of what's already out there on the market and starting to delve into the other 99.99% of bugs that are important for our health.
Well, you know what? This is speaking into a space that you heard me in the introduction say. I just, I don't know, the first 10 years of my career, I think 1 in 3 of my patients, at one point I had polled them, and if they weren't running a multi-level marketing for supplements, they were the #1 consumer of those supplements. And it became such a sore in my life that they were using marketing science, not really any evidence-based science, or any kind of sometimes logic. Like, you are 100 pounds overweight, and I know you think oatmeal is feeding your gut biome and the yogurt you're having with it is helping you, but you missed the big picture. There is a way bigger problem happening here. And I actually really liked how when Peter and you were talking, he said, yeah, I've considered this junk science. And it's almost something like I wouldn't even say out loud, like, oh, I don't want to hurt anybody's industry. But those prebiotics they're wasteful. And anytime I had seen a scientific paper where they were trying to look at what bug are you trying to put in the gut, and did that bug change the outcome for the patient? And then did the pill not just contain the skeleton parts of the bug, but actually have a spore in the capsule that would ignite in the human body, that would actually seed the gut biome with the said bacteria. Or yeah, they are. I mean, the ones that are from your company named Pendulum have gone through quite the rigorous life history to be found in your capsule. Maybe you could share some of the struggles you've had at figuring out how did you get to this collection of would you call them prebiotics? Probiotics when they're the bug, prebiotics when that's what they eat. Is that the right?
Yes, yeah, we can do a quick 101 of the vocabulary, which is ever expanding in this space. But essentially, probiotics are the bacteria themselves, and so that's the thing that's actually doing the activity. The prebiotics are the food that the probiotics eat, And then there's a new category called postbiotics, and those are the molecules that the bacteria make. And so what we've developed is a kind of a combination of probiotics and the prebiotics, which is a symbiotic. So this is definitely a vocabulary lesson here, but essentially it is the bugs that do the work plus the food that feeds them and combined into the capsule. And I think, when we started this company, the idea was to try to understand um, what is it that people are missing that's important for their health? And we've really focused in on metabolism. A lot of people think about probiotics in the gut as related to GI distress. So, oh, I take a probiotic because I get diarrhea or because I am constipated or I have bloating. But actually, the gut is tied to a far more number of systems than just GI. And the one that we were really interested in is metabolism, because the food that you eat, of course, it first goes into the stomach, but eventually the majority of the important stuff that's happening is metabolized in your gut microbiome. And so what we discovered is that people that have obesity, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, are low or entirely missing certain functions in their microbiome. And so the theory was, if you could really understand the functions that were missing and why that would have any impact on metabolic disease and give them back to people, could you help them improve their metabolic health? And that was sort of the whole premise of the company. So figure out, what people are missing, see if you can give it back to them, and see if by giving it back to them, you can help them with their metabolic health. And that's what we've spent the last decade trying to figure out.
Well, it is no small question. It is no small component. Even when looking back at what gets taught, I mean, I was an assistant professor for a medical school, and the amount of time that we would spend teaching about the gut biome is a big goose egg. I mean, we would talk about the pathology associated with certain C. difficile, and we could probably all tell you that lactobacillus is found in yogurt and it metabolizes into lactate. But some really basic stuff that we learned as budding clinicians. For the space that this has had to fill up in my brain is now like a quarter of my head since Christmas, where those little critters living in our gut, they really are outside our body. That tube from your mouth to your anus is for these foreigners to live within you, but really are partnering for your best health. And on this channel, we talk a lot about what fuel source are you feeding your mitochondria? Is it a carbohydrate? Is it a fatty acid? Is it a ketone? Is it alcohol? And with that comes your energy level. But I hadn't even allowed for the space that those bacteria living in the mucosa of the that second half of your small intestine and the large intestine, they get a lot of credit for how much of your carbohydrates have been metabolized and what happens to them. Maybe you could just speak into that a little, this tiny little paragraph about how does, because you could go on for about a day probably, how do our bacteria impact that metabolism of glucose in those sections of our gut?
Yeah, so I think probably one of the most important things is to know that we have co-evolved with these microorganisms sort of since our caveman and cave girl days. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that there are foods that we eat that are really beneficial for our health that we actually cannot metabolize. We entirely depend on our gut microbes to metabolize them. So, for example, fiber. We all know a high fiber diet is really good for us. So even though you haven't been a believer in probiotics, you've probably been a believer in high fiber for a while. And so knowing that, that whole food section of the grocery store, fruits and vegetables and all of those have really beneficial value for us. But for the most part, you need your gut microbiome in order to metabolize those. And one of the most important things that your gut microbiome does when it metabolizes those fibers is it stimulates the production of butyrate, which is a small molecule that then stimulates the production of GLP-1, which has become a very popularized small molecule. And GLP-1 is important because it helps your body manage your insulin and glucose response. And so at the end of the day, when you think about this whole pipeline from, the fibers that you eat to the, microbes that are metabolizing it, to the production of butyrate, to the production of GLP-1, to insulin and glucose tolerance, if you're missing these microbes, you're missing a vital step in all of that. you actually don't get any of the benefit of fiber. So all the great fibers that you're eating are literally going right through you. And so that's where the gut microbiome starts to play a really important role. You could be eating the right foods, doing the right exercise, living the right lifestyle, stress-free, doing your meditation, and still be missing these gut microbes that are important. And that's why you still don't have metabolic health.
Excuse me. Yes. So on this channel, one of the other guests that I have actually very few guests that I could bring onto the show. So welcome to the short list. You can say you've been on this podcast for sure. Actually was one of the carnivore kings, you could call him, Sean Baker, having been a clinician, an orthopedic surgeon who exited medicine when his passion for helping people stay out of his operating room really got him at crosshairs with the administration for how to do surgery. The story is not uncommon, but his choice to stand firm in this is the path that will help more people, despite it not being as lucrative, is wow. He really has stood the test of time. He also has put forth his efforts to look into how can we put evidence behind staying in a, in his case, it's a carnivore, and many people that are on a ketogenic diet really do take that fiber down to almost zero. In fact, that's what got my hairy eyebrow when I was listening to that podcast saying, all right, so how do I think through this? What's the GLP-1 for somebody who doesn't eat fiber, who doesn't have a vegetable load? And in the space of the ketogenic diet, I'll give you just the framework for what most people coming onto my channel have been overweight for many years, at least a decade. And that high insulin state is very predictable. It has been the source of the chronic cellular inflammation that stops their mitochondria from staying fresh and in their best shape. It also stops their brain from being as healthy, heart disease, all the things that are linked to that chronic higher blood sugar and that chronic higher insulin. When we push them into a ketogenic state, they can't make a ketone, almost universally cannot make a ketone unless their total carbohydrate consumption, and that includes fiber, gets below zero, or gets below 20 grams per day. It's in that state that we can then start to see ketones in circulation, really that their insulin was been pathologically elevated. In order to lower that insulin, we had to cut their carbs, because even the consumption of a non-absorbable fiber stimulated the production of insulin, which capped their fat cells closed, and that circulation of fat became almost zero. So you look at Sean Baker and I have both been on stage at places like KetoCon, where we always get asked, but how can you live without fiber? And of course, he's a much better display of flexing the carnivore diet, because, well, his arms are the size of my thighs, and he's like 6'3", and he's just all muscle. And he goes, I haven't had fiber in, I think it's now 8 years. And you say, well, clearly something's going right. So can you help wrap your mind around how do people on a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet, how do we help our GLP-1 axis be healthy?
Well, you're getting in a territory that I am not. Yeah, I'm not a clinician, and I'm certainly not a ketogenic expert in the nowhere close to what you know. But I would say that, and I would also say that actually there are not that many studies around the ketogenic diet and the microbiome. And there's a couple, but not. I have not been. It's not been clear to me this link, but I do think that the two things are related to each other. So maybe what I would say is that if you want to have a high-performing vehicle, it's not just about the high-performing fuel that you put in that vehicle, but it's also about the engine that you have. And the engine here is the microbiome. The fuel is the food that you're ingesting. And making sure that the nutrition, the fuel, and the engine are paired properly is probably far more relevant than trying to make blanket statements about what everybody should or shouldn't be eating, or what microbes everybody should or shouldn't have. And so I'll just caveat everything by saying we're in the early stages of understanding microbiome science, and certainly the personalized part of it is a big black box. So that's all a long-winded way of saying that I don't really understand how the ketogenic diet and these different strains interact with each other. And I don't think that there's actually been really strong data supporting how they work together.
Well, so I think that is one of the best and most refreshing answers, almost as refreshing as when I heard you on the podcast in the places where you leave it to Peter Attia to take all of us to the edge of what we understand and then say, come on, explain that. And you're like,
I don't know.
you go to the next step, Peter. We'll hang out here until you figure it out and teach us all at the end. But that's where I've been too. In fact, I'm going to reach over off screen and grab this book, Good Energy, is by Casey Means, the physician who is in charge of levels. And in there, she writes about her struggle with, yes, fiber has been this important part that as soon as you look at the lessons we've taught about the ketogenic diet and then the lessons your company has done an excellent job stating that if you want to make GLP-1, you're going to need a special kind of bacteria. We're going to get to that in a minute. You're going to need some polyphenols, which in my life, where I get polyphenols is a bunch of algae, and that is super counterculture to who I am. I grew up I'm from a dynasty of hog farmers. So we grew up in the prairies of South Dakota and with a garden of our own. And those vegetables really only lasted a short time. They were not as abundant but we had plenty of processed food. And that processed food led to pathology in me and my family, despite having that close connection to our healthy nutrition. So to add some kind of, well, as my dad would call it, some California idea of a vegetable is algae.
Exactly. Well, it's funny because I grew up in the South, so I grew up on like a quasi-ketogenic diet by accident. But I'm also grew up on Chinese food, which is heavily, vegetable based. And so I think, it's interesting how our microbiome is really formed based on the food that we're eating. And then we're sort of living with these microbes based on what we grew up on. And now we evolve our thinking, we evolve our eating, and it's all kind of evolving alongside of us. But we don't really, I think a lot of us haven't really thought about our microbiome in that particular way. But I am curious because you've had experience with the products now,
Yeah.
and in the context of the ketogenic diet, how do you think about it? I'd love to hear your perspective.
So this is great because it has led me into, I have a chart that I'll pull up, and I apologize when I show the chart, I won't be able to show your face, so you'll be off for just a minute, but they will be able to hear you. So this is the price of not flying my producer with me to Texas as I put on this podcast. But the beautiful part is, as I heard that podcast and could really look in the face of, okay, this is a missing component for what I'm teaching, that, that blanket statement that I had told patients for years, you must have this many grams of fiber. Every textbook is telling me this is how you scrub your colon, only to find that these chronic inflammatory processes inside a gut were made worse by that high fiber diet in patients with a high inflammatory state. So let me say that again. In my clinic, where I start at puberty, I take them to the grave, I do not catch babies, and I don't do surgery. I am the master of managing chronic problems. And if I do my job, you'll never know the problems we prevented. And I say that because they take decades really to really manifest in the symptoms, and the human body will do a whole bunch of things to protect you from that decline in function, that decline in quality of life is not 2 weeks into a broken leg that you're missing out on your running. It is 3 decades of elevated cellular inflammatory processes. And I do believe that a healthy gut and its addition of fiber would be a good idea. But when they've come to me in this chronic inflammatory, the gut lining is leaking out as many mismatches. I mean, it's on its way to an ulcerative problem because it's got such chronic inflammation. And the first stages of that are where they'll come to me. They'll say, "Doc, my gut's leaky." I hate that word, but it really is the permeability of what's supposed to stay in the body and what's supposed to stay in the, the tunnel where those critters live and all your food gets processed. There's supposed to be a beautiful barrier. And when that barrier doesn't work right, people are very sick. So adding fiber in that setting just tore them up. They would have bloody diarrhea. They would not have any of their manifestations really progress in the right direction. And it wasn't until I started just methodically saying the first thing we're going to fix is this chronic inflammatory process by removing the hyperproduction of insulin in a diet that has nearly zero fiber and less than 20 total grams per day. And Colleen, I have had to erase things from my list that I would say, you have this problem, you're never going to get rid of it. And I've said those words and had to have some humble pie saying, I was wrong. I didn't think you could heal from that. And it's inspiring because it makes me be very careful about what I say, because people are listening, not just behind an exam room door anymore. It's on this YouTube thing where, okay, so what's the story about fiber? So when I've been adding patients, so when I heard your podcast, the first thing I did was said, okay, I'm going to try this. I've been wearing a continuous glucose monitor for a while now, and I'm going to show you the first couple of weeks of being on your product. Again, very little impact will have happened in those first 14 days of taking that supplement. And then I'll show you the comparison of maybe something closer to the last 2 weeks in a 14-day period. As I push that idea out there, your product is, so before I show the product, let's have you explain what bugs are in there. And after you've said what bugs are in there, and there's actually kind of a mixture, because I'm taking the one that was the glucose control. It has a blend and some, I think, inulin is in it. You can correct me. And I have a strategy for how I recommend this for patients, but I'm pretty healthy. So as I toss this idea out of testing your supplement, let's have you throw down a hypothesis. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think the results would be?
Excuse me. Sure. So the product that you took, Pendulum Glucose Control, is a consortia of 5 strains, for which you actually can't find anywhere else on the market because they were entirely novel and discovered and actually can't be manufactured by anybody else. But the 5 strains work together to perform 2 key functions. One is to produce short-chain fatty acids, in particular butyrate, and that's known to stimulate GLP-1 production in the body, so that should help lower blood glucose spikes and A1C. And then the second function is with particularly one of the strains called Akkermansia muciniphila. This is the only strain that we know of to date that actually lives in the gut lining and is there to regulate that gut lining. And so the second part is, so first is the generation of short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, and the other is actually the regulation of that gut lining. And so to your point, so-called leaky gut, or things where you don't have the right amount of mucin or glue that holds those different cells together, that is a kind of really global problem in a lot of different disease states. And so it's interesting when you talk about, fiber in an already inflamed state can cause even more damage to a person. And so as a result of that, actually reducing fiber is beneficial. I can't help but think of the fact that also not having these microbes and not having, the right amount of Akkermansia to help you ensure that you have this solidified gut lining, solidified mucin layer is an important part to that. And so if you're missing those microbes and you're in an inflamed state, and then you're eating fiber and you're kind of have this exacerbated problem, you're not solving it. And so by giving people back these microbes that are helping them to metabolize that fiber, it's what allows you to now kind of get those benefits from both of them. So Pendulum Glucose Control was designed for people with type 2 diabetes to help lower A1C and blood glucose spikes. But as we all know, it's not just having type 2 diabetes where you have an inability to metabolize your glucose as well. That happens to us as we age. That happens to us as we go through periods of intense stress. That happens to us as we actually even our circadian rhythm changes. That happens for women when we go through menopause. So there are a lot of reasons why our ability to metabolize glucose can become hampered. And so these strains are designed to help us be able to metabolize our glucose better. So I'm just dying to see your data, actually.
Okay. Well, before I reveal that, I'll tell you the other time that I went into this deep rabbit hole of trying to understand how much a gut biome would impact a patient is when all the craze of, I had patients coming to say, I want a poop transplant. I'm like, what? And it wasn't a psychiatric diagnosis they were chasing. It was actually I've read about on these health magazines that if you have a transfer of the gut, of your stools from a healthier person, and of course there were a couple mouse studies that said when they took these obese mice and they gave them the stools from the thin mice, then the obese mice lost weight. So I was very like, wow, that is super strange. How did that happen? And then the more I looked into it, and correct me if I'm wrong, man, you can change your own gut biome, what's growing in your gut. I mean, if you take your blood sugar from an out of the control range to a much more controlled range, different set of gut biome shows up. You were just listing several of these other places. If they had not been sleeping well, their gut biome from when they weren't sleeping well to when they were sleeping well was dramatically different. That if you went on vacation and you studied your gut, your stools before you left for vacation, and then you came back, with all the disruption of different foods and environments and sleeping, it was like it didn't match you anymore. It was so different. So to say, I'm going to let you spend $1,500 under this, prescribed, trade poop with a neighbor, I couldn't do it. I was like, how do you know what's in his poop? And he said, well, he had it tested. When did he have it tested? If it was 6 weeks ago and he went on a drinking binge, you don't know what he's got anymore. And I mean, that skepticism of, is there any science behind this? Again, it was refreshing to hear you talk about it. Like, yep, I've seen that. And you actually brought up all of the objections that I just mentioned, but it was on that podcast where I'm like, she is suspicious of this plan too. But those stool transplants don't. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that stool transplants as a general therapeutic for everybody is riddled with safety concerns. However, what I will say is that stool transplants have been an incredibly powerful tool for understanding where the microbiome may or may not play a role. And so some of these really powerful studies in type 2 diabetes, for example, where you take stool from a healthy patient, put it into a patient that has type 2 diabetes, and you start to see resolution of their symptoms, that tells you that there's something in that gut microbiome that's playing a role. And so I think, there are a lot of unanswered questions that we've had about, gee, why does, my metabolic health get worse as I age? Why do I have, brain fog after lunch? Why am I not sleeping as well? Does somebody go on the same diet that I go on, and yet they seem to reap so many benefits and I don't? And, I think what we're starting to discover is that the microbiome is a really important factor in all of that. And so those stool transplants have shown us that there are, in this question of nature versus nurture, there are things in the nurture part that can really impact our health. So regardless of what genes you're born with or what runs in your family, there are things that you have power over and things that you can change in your microbiome that can actually change your health status. And so that's really, I think, the opportunity here in health is to understand the role of the microbiome and how can we use that to benefit our health.
Absolutely. I think you hit on exactly what I had struggles with in the past of how do you, hold on here a second. How do you impact the choices that the patient should make relative to their resources? That when they come in and they want a stool transplant and they still have like 16 other things that are going to kill them long before their gut biome will, you say, all right, I learned so much by that deep dive of, who would ever think of a stool transplant? And then to look what we learned from it was fascinating. To get to the point where you say, now go do it. That was the part where I got hung up saying, I don't think this is the right timing. I think you're going to spend a lot of money and you're going to come back to me and say, why'd you let me spend all that money? And when these other things should have been handled first. Meaning not a disconnect that something clearly is connected to this gut biome, And thank God for the people on the front lines helping us understand that. But as you open it up to the market of, should I do this? Dude, I have a colleague who had he taught me more because he did them. And I said, I'll refer them to you. And I won't refer you everybody, but the ones that are where I seem to have their metabolic health as good as I can get it before we spend those resources. All right, let's go to my numbers, because we are, I do want to keep your time controlled. Let me see, I've got this. I want to go over here to Safari. And don't give up on me here. It's going to work. There we go. Aha. So, all right. So this is just a picture of the data, and Colleen, you can see this, but you can't. We can't see her. So hang tight. I'm going to show the data, then I'll put it back on the screen. All right. So I took 2 time frames, and you can see. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor there, but January 1st through January 16th. Gave us 16 days where I was wearing that continuous glucose monitor. And we compared it to May 1st through May 14th. Again, about 14 days where I was wearing the continuous glucose monitor. You can see that there is a pretty controlled glucose for what I do in each week, that there are times in life where I'm not perfect. And that seems to have a different trend. It was my hope that when I did this, I walked into some pretty good skepticism, like, will I notice anything? Will I be able to feel a sense of satiety if this is a higher production of the GLP-1 that naturally is in my gut? So the average blood glucose in the first section for those 16 days was an average of 99 with an A1C of 5.7. Again, I like to point out to everybody, I'm not perfect. That the data was, this is the part that I wanted to make sure everybody saw, that I only was wearing the CGM for 14 of those 16 days. That's why the time range looks a little off, but we were trying to get 14 days compared to 14 days. And so the A1C for that time was a 5.7, and the average blood glucose was 99. In the world of diabetes, people would say, oh, you are fine, there's no problem. But for folks that follow this channel, we really do reach for that glucose, that A1C closer to 5.0. Or at least 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. I don't know if I'll ever be good enough to get down to that, but let's go over here and show you what happened after I was super compliant for the first 2 months, and then I'm human and maybe wasn't perfect for the last month, so it took me probably 3.5 to almost 4 months to get my 3 months in. My blood glucose dropped by about 10 points with an A1C in, again, 14 milligrams per deciliter standard deviation, so very similar control, but down to an average of an A1C of 5.4, which is closer to my personal goal. Again, this is the 14 days out of 14 days that we were trying to make sure everybody, that I had 14 days under observation, if you would. So again, comparing the A1C when I was, at the end of the 3 months down to a glucose of 89, average, and an A1C of 5.4 compared to a glucose of 99 and an average of 5.7. And just one more time to let you see the range of that blood sugar here and the range of that blood sugar here. And what do I think about that? I think I can tell you that I tried really hard to argue with myself. Am I having placebo? Because one of my failures, and I think it's very foundational in my family of origin, is that we're farmers. We would work hard. We'd come home at night, and we had supper, not dinner. We had supper, and supper always happens after dark when you're done working. And so this concept that eating late at night is normal was a very big problem for me. And as I have worked thanks to many patients showing me the danger of what does it look like when you have a metabolic issue and you put food in after sunset, and the power of the backward slide when I do that. So many nights I don't do that, but when I do it, it's from a sense of grazing, a sense of I'm not really hungry. There's this thing. And So what I was hoping for, I believe in, I'm a woman of faith and I believe in specific prayers. And I said, if this thing does one thing, I want it to help me with when I have that craving, I can just let that go and not satisfy it with even just a handful. But in somebody with a metabolic dysfunction in the past, it really can throw a monkey wrench into the dysfunction of your glucose the next morning. So it was about the second month where I was doing something that's pretty stressful for us, which is our metabolic. We have a big class once a year that we walk folks through 21 days of a very advanced ketogenic lifestyle. And it's very intense and it's something I love doing. But afterwards, the stress is down and I'll eat more than I should. And I found myself after that class not doing that. Like, it was very remarkable. In fact, my husband's like, wow, you dealt with that class a lot better than you have your other ones. Your stress seems less. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, could it be GLP-1? Could it be that my ability to feel full or satisfied is really lasting longer throughout the day? So having looked at that, do you have any thoughts on my experience? And first of all, your drug in an N of 1 in somebody who's already pretty healthy?
So initially when we developed Pendulum glucose control, it was for people with type 2 diabetes. And we ran, a clinical trial that's been published in BMJ showing that it could lower A1C and blood glucose spikes in people with type 2 diabetes in a placebo-controlled double-blinded randomized trial. So your N of 1 matches kind of what we saw in those clinical trials, which is a lowering of A1C and of blood glucose spikes. And so I think that is so awesome to see. And I think it also shows us that while the, FDA has defined what it is to have type 2 diabetes and to say, oh, if you have type 2 diabetes, that means you're in this range and you're only eligible for certain drugs if you are in that range. I think what your data shows, and you're among many, many other people, is that metabolic health is not confined to those particular numbers, but that many of us have the opportunity to improve our metabolic health through these interventions. And GLP-1 is something that right now, of course, is a massive craze, but the reason is because it's such a powerful hormone. The GLP-1 drugs that are out there are synthetic versions that are mimicking a natural hormone that our body makes. And that natural hormone's job is to tell us when we're full. And so actually the way that it's supposed to work is you eat food, your gut microbiome helps you metabolize that food. It stimulates GLP-1, and GLP-1 is a signal that tells your brain, hey, we just ate, we're done. We don't need to eat anymore.
Mm-hmm. No, that summary is exactly what you look at in my case. I kept saying, well, I can stimulate that butyrate because there's butter in my ketogenic diet. And then I kept thinking, but even if I produce the butyrate to that part, don't I still need those bacteria to really help burst that optimal amount of GLP-1? And I mean, you can correct me, but that the presence of butyrate is only part of this process. That bacteria will enhance that and will rise the vacuoles, or the number of vacuoles, or the percentage of how much of that hormone is present in those L cells in the distal part of that small intestine and in the first part of that large intestine, in order to get that hormonal response. True?
Exactly. And so, and also the other thing to keep in mind is that the microbiome is an ecosystem. So there are a bunch of different strains that are working together, but there are very specific ones that help you stimulate that GLP-1 production. And so you might have a so-called healthy gut, but you might be missing these specific microbes that are there to stimulate GLP-1. And so it's not just about general gut health. It's actually about very specifically what are the microbes that are helping you stimulate GLP-1. And if you were able to boost them, that you would be able to boost your GLP-1 response. And what you would feel on the other side of that is what you're talking about. That's satiety. So not having food cravings that you used to have. And so one of the studies that we did, we showed that using the food cravings inventory, excuse me, which is a diagnostic test for food cravings. We showed that after being 6 weeks on this probiotic formulation, which gives you back these strains that stimulate GLP-1, after being on it for 6 weeks, 91% of people had reduced food cravings. And that's across the 4 major food cravings types: sugars, carbs, fast foods, and high fat foods. Everybody knows which bucket they fall into.
Yeah.
And so what we showed is that 91% of people are able to reduce those. And that's not people who have crazy food cravings or battling insane obesity. These are just regular people. We all kind of have food cravings that we are fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And so your ability to get off that cycle of craving those foods late at nights or craving them, at the end of a hard, long day helps get you into a better routine overall. And so that's really what we're going after. It's these little nudges, these little improvements, these little hacks to our bodies that can help us get into a better place. And so your numbers are amazing, and your reduction in those cravings late at night, that is exactly what we're trying to help the body do naturally.
Right. Well, the ability to test and to look at that as a, we push this for people to say, don't take my word for it. Do what I did. Watch your numbers. Take inventory. Much like what we would ask a company in your setting to do, which you haven't spoken about on this one. So I'm going to give you the space to do that before I have some questions that the audience has typed in, and they're pretty good questions. So let's hope I can answer them all. I just want you to speak to how many other folks in this space are trying to create a bacteria that you swallow that actually goes into your body, that sporinates into the bacteria that is on the label, and how you and many of us have seen what they're swallowing and what there's on the label is not the same thing until a very fantastic commitment to the scientific process of creating these in the absence of oxygen, like your company has done.
I mean, the supplement space is riddled with all sorts of fly-by-nighters and people trying to take advantage of everyone who's trying to do good by their body. So people who are trying to improve their gut health, trying to increase their levels of these important strains, and being basically fooled by people who are trying to make a quick buck. It is pretty disheartening if you spend too much time thinking about it. But the good news is that you actually can benefit your health if you're getting the right microbes from the right place. And so one of the things that you're trying to do as a company is, or as scientists, is you're trying to take these key strains that live in the distal colon of your gut microbiome. And what that means is that you've gotten through the stomach, you've gotten through the small intestines, and you're all the way in the distal colon. There's no oxygen there, but that's where all the action is happening. That's where all the microbes are. That's where they're functioning. They're producing these small molecules. Your gut lining is super important. They're interacting with your immune response, your inflammatory response, your metabolism. So that's where all of the action is happening. And in order to create something that helps people, you have to take the microbes out of that part of the body. You have to grow them up in an artificial environment, a manufacturing plant. You have to then put them in a capsule that a person can ingest. It has to make its way back through the stomach, the small intestine, all the way to the distal colon. The capsule has to open up. These strains have to recolonize and come back to life and then perform the functions that you want. So a lot of things have to go right before this thing works, before you actually have the impact that you want. And so one of the most important things that you can look for is, is the company actually making the strains that they say they're making? And I will tell you right now, there are a lot of what we call fakermansias, fake companies putting Akkermansia on the market because you're trying to get Akkermansia into your body and you know it's good for you. And they are putting on the label they have Akkermansia. They don't. They are just have all these random lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains. So the first thing is the company legit. Are they actually making the things that they say that they're making? That's super hard to discern. People are going to look to people like you to help them understand who's making it and who's not. But the second thing to look for is it a capsule that has an enteric coating to it? The enteric coating gets you through the stomach acid, so enteric coating. And then the second thing is, does it have a time-delayed release? So we have both of those. The enteric coating gets it through the stomach acid. The time-delayed release gets it to the distal colon. And the most important thing is this going to have a health outcome? It's what you said. measure, measure, measure. And so don't just take our clinical trial data for it. Don't just take Dr. Boz's, experience. Measure for yourself. Is this thing actually helping you? Because the truth is, it may not be your microbiome that is the problem, but if it is, you'll be able to see a real outcome if you're taking the product.
It's great. It's absolutely the kind of, I was hoping for a positive experience, not only because I'm terrible about taking pills. I tell people to do them all the time, but I told my husband I wanted to be, help me with this commitment to keep this at the front part of the refrigerator. Do not put the milk in front of it, because that's just enough barrier for me to forget to take it for a week, and really say, I want to see the commitment, see the outcomes, and I will have this commitment to see where this leads. And in part, it was because of the rigor that your company has put forth in actually getting this really sensitive bug to be stuffed into a capsule that gets to the part of your body that needs it. I will circle back and answer some of the strategies that when people have asked me, should I do this? I think it's just like that conversation I was having with the guy who wanted to have oatmeal for breakfast and a bunch of yogurt because it was going to help his gut biome and be heart healthy. When really he's 100 pounds overweight and we have other problems we're going to need to fix before you're, if you really want to help your heart, we need to decrease the size of your waistline. That I wouldn't wait till then to offer this to a patient, but I would really get them into a stable rhythm of eating. And that beginning setting of a ketogenic diet often confronts them with their addiction, their constant source of, I get pleasure from food. It's the number one place I get pleasure from. Who gets pleasure from anything else? We're done eating. What time do we eat next? That obsession that when disease settings have just washed over every cell in their body, step one is let's back off on how often you're eating and how much of your body is fueled by glucose versus let's get some fats that float throughout your body. And the only way we can do that is to empty a bunch of those fat cells, to lower that insulin, and really create a better place that if you're going to add, because I think for 3 months supply, it was a good chunk of change, $400 and some dollars. And you can correct me, maybe it was 500, I can't remember. But the punchline was that it was expensive, and I want that to impact their health when they're going to pay for that, so that at least they've got those blood sugars controlled, or what you said, which I think is again something that Casey Means really writes about in her book, and I have seen as the ability to watch patients as they go from a metabolism that's rather broken to one that's much more robust, and that is the volatility of how much food spikes when you eat. And even on a personal note, when I would look back at some of my readings from randomly wearing a continuous glucose monitor, now I don't go without one because it's such an accountability for me to watch what my numbers are doing. But that volatility of the spiking and crashing of blood sugars, and how that probably is what I enjoy the most since the beginning of January to now, and in part really seeing how much that dovetailed into the taking your product. So when I tell patients to buy it, I tell them, if you're all over the place in your eating and your blood sugars are still really out of control, control those before you try to seed your gut with a bacteria that is going to help you, but will help you a lot. Will stay present, and your resources will be, I think, connected to your journey a lot better if you master that almost chaos in the way you're eating before you add tell me which one I bought again, the glucose control.
I think the glucose control, which is sort of, the most expensive Cadillac of them. It's the one that has the clinical trial behind it for diabetes, which is probably why it's the one that you picked. But I do want to address the cost for a second, because it is expensive. And it's not that we're out there trying to fleece people. These strains are actually really expensive to make. They're all made here in the United States. So everything is manufactured in the USA, which in and of itself is more expensive.
Right.
A lot of the products that you buy, they're manufactured in China or India. And to be frank, it's just a lot cheaper to be able to manufacture something in those countries than it is in the US. However, by manufacturing it here in the US, we know the quality of what we're making, and we know that it's consistently of that quality. And we are trying to deliver on a health promise to people. And so that's super important to us. So the first thing is that the strains are manufactured in the United States. These strains cannot be manufactured by anybody else. So we are the only ones who know how to do them. And it's actually been really hard to figure out how to manufacture the strains. And then, the delivery, as we talked about, we're not just throwing these in, slapping these in any old capsule. We are trying to put them in the top of the line. These are pharmaceutical grade capsules that get the enteric coating and the time delayed release in. And so the product is expensive to make, which is why it is high priced. And we're not trying to take advantage of anybody. But I do suggest to people that do the 90-day challenge that you did, which is give yourself 90 days to see if you see a change. And if it doesn't work for you, don't stay on it. I mean, we're not here to trick anybody. Our mission is really to help people improve their health. And so, and the other thing to say is that if after 90 days it works for you, you might not need to stay on the probiotics forever. And so there are other ways in which you can try to sustain these strains once you've seen the benefits from them. And so I don't want people to feel like we're trying to trick them or trying to fleece people. We really aren't. If you can, for 90 days, pay this, amount, but get a real metabolic health benefit, there are ways that you might be able to not have to stay on the strains. And you think for 1 second how much money I spend at Starbucks every day, or my kids spend at Starbucks every day, it adds up, and you're doing something beneficial for your health here. And I would say, I hope that it's worth the investment to at least try it for 90 days to see if it helps people.
Yeah, it truly is the reason I reached out to say, I want this company to succeed. I have been such a naysayer of this whole space because in part of that, just to look at the cost of having, the equipment to be in an oxygen-free environment, like that alone, when I would look at some of these supplements saying, you're making an anaerobe. There's no way you can make an anaerobe for that price. It isn't possible. And I mean, just the price alone would get me angry. Like, don't ask me to tell my patients to take this. It's like asking the 100-pound overweight guy to eat yogurt. Like, you can do it and tell yourself you're being healthy, but it's not with my endorsement because there's so many flaws in the thinking. I don't need to go into the lab to tell you that they're not making an anaerobic, very elite bacteria in their capsule. I can tell you by the price. That's not sustainable as a business. So I'm really here to endorse not only my results. I'll tell you personally, I took it for 3 months. I went on the subscription. And when I got the second batch of the 3 months, I've sponsored a couple people on my team to do this for them. And I did keep one bottle so that I might not take it every day, but I keep adding it saying, well, I don't want it to go away. And I don't know what it does yet, or I don't know what it's like to be completely off of it, but I'm definitely making sure that I at least have one bottle in my fridge.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Well, I do have lots of questions here on the channel. I'm gonna answer some of those. Well, actually, it's the top of the hour. Gosh, the questions are really good, though. I might actually save them for next week, and I'll answer them without you on, if that's okay. That would just probably wrap it up for the keeping it to an hour. And asking people on YouTube to watch anything for an hour is an act of miraculous divine intervention. So I think we've provided a pretty good resource for how this works, where my suspicion is for do you need to have fiber? I will tell you that I'm a lot more consistent about taking my algae, as much as it makes my dad think I sold out, to take the algae, which has a bunch of polyphenols in it, yet a low carbohydrate response, something that I do not spike my sugars on. When I take that specifically, I'm sure of it when I take your supplement. So, well, I think we're going to say I highly recommend that you check out their website. Is it Pendulum Life or Pendulum for Life?
PendulumLife.com.
There you go. Thank you.
And I think for all of your listeners, if they put in Dr. Boz when they check out, they actually get a discount off their first bottle.
Perfect. Well, any way that I can keep supporting the good science in this industry, it gives me hope in humanity. So that's a good thing.
Thank you for your support and your time.
You bet, everybody. I'll be signing off. If you don't want to just stay put for 1 second, Colleen, we will sign off for everybody else and say thanks for checking in. We'll get these questions followed up in the upcoming